Welcome to the first episode of the Rest Stop podcast. It is exciting to have this time to look at God's work within the narrative portions of the Bible. I am joined by two fellow workers in the cause of the gospel, Cody and Jonah. And in this episode, we will consider the creation week as God showed his infinite power in creating this universe and all that it contains in those 6 24-hour days. You know, guys, I'm always kind of amazed at just the power that is exhibited in the creation. You know, there's no, we talk about various miracles in the Bible and the power that's demonstrated in them. You know, you can think about Lazarus and Jesus raising him from the dead. You can think about Jesus stilling the storm on the Sea of Galilee, or Moses and the 10 plagues that came upon Egypt. That certainly was quite the exhibition of power. But nothing compares really, as far as just in sheer exertion of power, to the creation. I mean, when you think about, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and if you have any idea, if you if you remember anything from your science classes, right? I mean, if you have any idea of the vastness of this universe, that immediately kind of strikes you with a sense of awe, doesn't it?
Yeah, I I always take us back to Job, but I think that there's a reason that whenever the Lord answers Job and kind of points out the almost the pride that Job has, there's a reason that the creation is kind of what he points to. I mean, when you go to Job 38, there he starts saying who stretched out the line, who laid the cornerstone of the world, and so it's he goes back to the greatest event that has ever been accomplished to kind of point out his divine power.
Yeah, he really does. And I mean, all of those, I mean, when you go through all those questions that, that he asked Job, that Job decides, you know what, I can't answer any of these. I should have never said, hey,
Mhm.
God, let me just come down here and let me set you straight. But when you look at this and you think about, I mean, when you look at those deep field pictures from like Hubble or the new James Webb telescope, and you literally see hundreds of galaxies. I mean, I stood I stood in Africa and I looked up and it was so dark there that the sky just was bursting with light from the stars, and you could see the Milky Way, cutting across there. Well, that's what I'm seeing there, and I'm seeing millions and millions and millions of stars, and yet what I'm seeing there is one galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, and there's the Andromeda galaxy, which is our nearest galaxy neighbor, so to speak, and that's still a very long way off. But when you look at that deep field picture from Hubble or James Webb telescopes, what you see is hundreds of galaxies, which they have millions of stars. I mean, the vastness of this creation is just it's hard to even comprehend in our small minds. I remember when I went to the Creation Museum, Joni, you may remember this. We went to the planetarium thing that they have, and they go out to Betelgeuse, which is the shoulder of the constellation Orion, and they look back, and our sun's not visible from there. And you're kind of like, wow, that's pretty incredible. But
Yeah,
just
not to
that idea is incredible.
yeah, not to mention all the stuff that we can't see that's even further out. Like what
Yes.
we see is not the limit, and what we can already see is already magnificent enough
Y-
and so far out there, but yet there's still even more way, way out there. So it just adds on to the sheer like near infinite magnitude that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of, well, those all those universes, galaxies that you see there in those deep field shots, we can't see those. I've had telescopes. I love astronomy, and I've had telescopes. And I can't see those. It's a challenge for me sometimes to find Andromeda, and that's the closest one. And it's actually visible to the naked eye, and so I think people need to see that. I think people miss this great demonstration of God's power that's in the creation, and because they don't really take in and think about for a moment that God just spoke that stuff into existence and it just happened. I mean, that's the kind of power we're talking about there. When we think about the omnipotence of God, it's an incredible thing. And I think one of the problems, guys, and you can kind of tell me if you agree with me on this, but I think one of the reason why people miss that, and maybe they don't spend much time really contemplating. And when I say most people, I'm talking about Christians here. I'm talking about people that are, those people that read the Bible and believe in the Bible, believe in God. I think that the reason why those people sometimes miss this great demonstration of God's power is because of the teaching of the theory of evolution today. I think it's been so ingrained in so many people and in so many ways that it removes God and it replaces his creative power, that vast power that's demonstrated, with an ever-changing story from the imaginations of men. I mean, would y'all agree with that, that's a part of that?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
it's
think
so.
it's go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I was just gonna say, I mean, it's so ingrained in society to the point where it's like kind of an assumption on certain issues. Like you think about the dinosaurs and them talking about the I was gonna say comet, but the asteroid, coming down and destroying them like that. That's kind of one of those common um theories that they bring up, and so it's a lot. It's like so ingrained enough to where it's commonplace, if you will.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's even more than the education, though. I think since almost since the beginning of time, we've almost done everything that we can to cover up that evidence of the creation. I mean, just think about all of the forests that are torn down, and we build parking lots in their place, and just the light pollution that covers up the all of those stars that
That's
we can
true.
see. I mean, you're talking about what you can see with James Webb and Hubble, but think back to the beginning of creation when they could literally look up and see so much more than we can see today. So I think that just the way that the world has developed, we've almost created distractions for ourselves that distract us from the divinity of God.
Yeah, and that's what, Paul was saying, wasn't it, to the Romans in Romans chapter
Mhm.
1, when he talked about, God's wrath being revealed from heaven against ungodliness and unrighteousness. And he says in verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident. It's evident within them, for God made it evident to them. He says in verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse, right?
Yeah.
You can't look at you can't look up in the sky and see that. And men, as perverse as man became, choosing to worship the created rather than the Creator who's blessed forever. People go on to say there in Romans chapter 1. Um, they would look up in that sky and they would be so struck with awe, but instead of turning to God, they chose to worship those things that they saw in the sky, right? The sun, the moon, and the stars. They worship those. I mean, when we look at the names of some of our planets, they are named as pagan gods, by ancient societies. So, it should be something that makes people see it. But if you've got your mindset that these things have come about through some kind of natural process rather than the supernatural process of God's creative ability, then you're going to lose a sense of awe in who God is, and you're going to look to things that are more of this physical world rather than the Creator who's blessed forever. Um,
Yeah,
you
when
know,
I am
Go ahead.
when I taught, I taught something along these lines, like, or more so talking about proof that the Bible exists through science and the Bible. I taught one class of that in middle school class at church, and I mean I think it was my last point where I essentially just said, I mean, just look around you, look at how complex everything is.
Yeah.
Like, how do you explain that? There's got to be an intelligent design, and obviously you can go a lot deeper than that. But it's like just the simple act of looking around us and just thinking about how the world is made and how unlikely it is that it could just happen just like that.
Yeah, the examples are many, for complexity. And I mean, we wouldn't have to go any further than our own bodies to look at a level of complexity that accident just cannot be the cause. And when you expand out on that to the universe as a whole, it becomes a vast body of evidence to the honest person, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to with really anything, right? You have to be honest with what you see. I mean, even in the ministry of Jesus, uh, there's people like Nicodemus, right, in John chapter 3, who says, no one can do the things you do except he be from God, right? Now, he saw the miracles that Jesus was performing, and his response to that, because he was honest with what he saw, well, that has to be from God. You know, in John 9, the blind man says, I was blind, but now I see, and only God can do that. He had an honesty about what was being done. But you look at other Pharisees in that same, in those same places, seeing those same miracles, and they would say things like, well, it's by the power of Beelzebub, or they just completely blind to it. And so we have to be honest with what we see, what the evidence is. And I think that's where the failure takes place, is that people aren't honest with evidence. It's out there, but yet they have perverted it to whatever cause they want it to fit. And that's where things kind of go awry. I mean, when we talk about evolution, we could spend the rest of this podcast on that. I don't really want that to be our purpose. The Bible is. I do accept the fact that the Bible is not a science textbook, but I do believe that it has scientific information that can bring us to better understandings of science. Science is that search for truth, supposedly, and the Bible is truth. And so there's things there for us to take from that and look at. I mean, especially what you were talking about, Cody, a while ago with Job.
Mhm.
I mean, there's scientific principles that God is addressing and asking Job about in those chapters there at the end. Some things that we still don't really, there's not, if he asked us today, we couldn't answer the questions. It's still.
Well, and you mentioned earlier the examples that people use to kind of demonstrate the complexity of it. And one of those that I've heard, and it's probably a common one that y'all have heard as well, that people use to kind of demonstrate that there was an intelligent creator, is that idea of if you put all of the parts of a watch in a box and then you close it and shake it, and then you open it again, like the chances of there being a fully functioning watch when you open that up. But it really goes beyond that, because those parts of the watch have to come from somewhere too. So really, if you follow along with the line of reasoning from atheism and evolution and everything, you've got to have an empty box and you've got to shake it and then have a working watch out of it.
I love it. Never heard that, but I love that idea. That you put the. I've given that same kind of idea. You have what one is where you have a tornado go through a junkyard and make a 747, but that's even better. The tornado has to go through nothing to get what you have given to us in the Scripture. I think that's a great example of that. Personally. I love science. I believe in science data. I took geology in college and loved it. And I can tell you, my professor, he may have been a Christian. I don't know what he taught in class. Certainly didn't go with the Bible. So in geology, that's where a lot of these erroneous dates and things like that come from. It's based on levels of where it's found in the soil and things like that. But I love geology. I thought it was very interesting science. Like I said, I love astronomy. But even and one of the great things is that even data that we see out there that is used for evolutionary purposes can also be used to prove the Bible to be true and accurate. There's scientific data out there that's being used by evolutionists. Now, they put it into a framework of evolution, but there's some things there in regard to the flood, in regard to maybe the way the earth was before the flood, that we have evidence out there that proves that stuff to be true. Now they give it other reasons, right? Different things happen for other, different whether they place it in some kind of era or whatever. But we can still use those things. I'm not anti-science by no means. I just think we have to be honest with it in a lot of ways. I think scientists love to denigrate faith as if it's something in opposition to science. but I would say they have the same problem they claim we have, wouldn't you?
Mhm. Well, and I think that they have more to prove just because of kind of the example that I gave earlier, because they still, I've heard the Big Bang theory and all those theories of the creation of the universe, but I still have not heard a reasonable explanation of, okay, what was that exploded in the first place? I mean, they bring up these theoretical particles and all of this, but it's like, okay, where did those particles come from? You have to have a beginning somewhere, and at least with what we're putting forth, we have a creation from a divine being that has always been there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they keep trying to get it really small, right? It started as an atom. Well, okay,
Mhm.
where'd you atom? I mean, they never can, because they can't go against their own laws and have something from nothing,
Yeah.
because that violates scientific law. Of course, they violate a lot of scientific laws. The law of biogenesis is violated routinely in the theory of evolution. But evolutionary thought. I mean, and well, for that matter, the laws of thermodynamics as well are always under assault. But evolutionary thought requires, when you agree, it demands that they have faith. I mean, they haven't seen the things they're talking about. There's no empirical evidence for evolution. They act like it's a fact that's been proven, and there's just absolutely zero doubt. But yet, they can't reproduce it in the laboratory, and that's required. From an empirical standpoint, they didn't see it. You didn't see it. You can't reproduce it. So, that's my definition of faith. Like, this some things hope for, and the evidence of things not
And,
seen. They're hoping that's true. They
Yeah.
have faith in it.
right.
The
Yeah.
sad
And,
thing
and
is they put
oh,
it
go ahead.
forth as fact, and so now this is like something that's been integrated into our education. So we're sending our kids to these schools, and that 8 hours a day, every day, they're being taught this thing as fact that's not fact. And I think that has kind of watered down the faith. And this is something that we mentioned, before we started recording, that there are even Christians, believers in the Bible, that are kind of taking the concept of evolution and they're trying to work it into their faith. I know growing up, and you talked about your professor, you said you didn't know whether he was a Christian or not. Well, the fact is that there are some, instructors that are teaching these theories and everything, that they are Christians. And so they have to reconcile with those two conflicting beliefs there. And so some of them are like, both are true. Yes, there's a creator, and he actually caused the Big Bang, but what they don't realize is that's going in direct contradiction with the Bible. So if,
Yes,
if you hold both of those as true, now you have to throw out the scripture, right?
that's right. I mean, they're really mutually exclusive. I think we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in just a moment when we talk about theistic evolution and what some people in the religious world are trying to do. Jonah, what were you going to say just a moment ago?
I was just going to go back to where you're talking about with faith. They have to have faith to believe all this stuff too. And, kind of going alongside that, correct me if I'm wrong, but, when you think about evolution as a process, there's always, and I may be oversimplifying this a lot, but, when we're talking about things evolving over time, this thing evolved to have, or like this animal evolved to have this kind of function to survive in this kind of environment. And it's like, are we implying that evolution has intelligence? And it's like, how does evolution know to change into that, to adapt to that environment? And what if evolution is wrong in what it changes in an animal over that long period of time? And how does it do that in that time before that animal goes extinct? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, of course, their thing is time is the ultimate cure of all things, right? But I mean, how
You can
does
do a lot
something,
of things with millions of years.
how does something that isn't equipped to live in an environment, how does it survive millions of years waiting for this? I know they've come up with what they call punctuated equilibrium, where you have these giant leaps in evolution all of a sudden out of the blue. Ideas. I mean, there's so many ideas in regard to evolution. We talk about like it's a singular thought, and yet within it there are a vast number of ideas and thoughts. That's why you know You know what it is? The fact that they want to have is that, well, it wasn't God. That's really the only thing that they want to
That's really
claim to
what
be
it
a
ultimately
fact,
comes
because
down to.
they don't have a singular thought on any of it, really. So science, if it proves it so quickly and so easily, why can't y'all agree on what the evidence says? And that's because it doesn't show something that easy for them to. They have to try to fit it into their little frameworks. That they've got in their head. The difference for Christians is that we accept faith as a reality, right? They don't want to accept it, but I didn't see the creation. I admit that. I can't reproduce it in a laboratory. I admit that. But I live believing with all my heart and having faith that it happened just as God said that it did. And so I think that's kind of the difference between us. We take faith as kind of a badge of honor. I'm proud of my faith, and they abhor faith in any way, it seems. I've always thought it'd be kind of funny. I heard a preacher say this a long time ago, and I thought it was kind of funny when I heard it, and it's kind of stuck with me. Is that they got their James Webb telescope and they're looking out there and they're looking for the end of the universe, because they think that they're going to be able to see the end of the universe by looking far enough out there. And I think it'd be funny if God just put a sign out there that said the end. Wherever that's at.
Little dead end sign on an asteroid.
just sign it God. That might end a lot if he just did that. But we'll see. Anything else on that, guys? Well, I think Joni, you mentioned this a while ago, that this idea, it's not just in our classrooms, in our textbooks, right? It's really, we're bombarded by it on a daily basis. In our TV, our movies, the internet. I mean, it's out there everywhere. I mean, there's some really good movies out there, that, at their core is evolution. I remember years ago when Harry Potter came out, and I had a lot of concerned parents because there was a lot of ruckus going on about, don't let your kids read Harry Potter, it teach them witchcraft. And, I read the books because I don't like to comment on things that I don't read or check on. I don't try not to just listen to what other people say. And, it struck me when I was dealing with that, these parents are so against Harry Potter, but they'll let their kids go to see Jurassic Park. Okay, so
Or Disney.
I don't think witchcraft. I've preached for 32 years, and I've had very little. I've had to deal with witchcraft very little, but I've had to deal with evolution a lot. And so, if I was going to weigh this as to which one was probably more dangerous, I would say Jurassic Park's more dangerous than Harry Potter. At the end of the day, would y'all agree with that?
It's amazing how much it has kind of permeated our society, because if you think about it, the ideas of those two, the idea of witchcraft and the idea of evolution, witchcraft has been around way longer than the idea of evolution has. But for whatever reason, evolution has just kind of overtaken the general idea of how the world works and kind of pushed everything else out.
Well, and it's literally created people's thought. I mean, it's created a truth in their minds. I mean, from watching movies.
Mhm.
You want to know when I've preached on creation and evolution stuff, you want to know what gets people most upset? You want to know what I say that gets people most upset? Is when I tell them dinosaurs and men existed together. I have had people just lose their minds. I'm talking about Christians here. They lose their minds because Jurassic Park has said it, and 100 other movies have said it, right? That men and dinosaurs just did not live together at any point in all this. The dinosaurs died millions of years, tens of millions of years before man ever showed up or crawled out of the slime or whatever. And people just can't handle that. I've had people come up to me after church and go, "Are you really think that?" I go, "Yeah, I really think that."
What I'm curious about, because I've grown up in the church, and so I've kind of heard that teaching all my life that we, humans were alongside dinosaurs. What is the alternative idea for Christians? Like, what do they honestly believe? Because we have, the evidence of the existence of dinosaurs, so they had to exist at some point in time.
Yes.
And we know that, there's a 6-day period of creation. So
Not much time for them to be
point
here.
I mean, did they live and die the day before man got there, or what's their idea?
They were dead by day 5. By the end of day 5,
They
they
really
just
didn't
couldn't
last
make
long.
it. Like the 6-hour dinosaur.
And I don't mean that to, sound condescending towards people that believe that in the church. I mean, I feel for them for, having that conflict in their minds. But when those people that speak to you, what is their idea of, where that comes in?
I just, I just, I think people just don't take time to reconcile what they think sometimes with what I think they also know. You know what do you understand what I'm saying when I say that? Because that sounds kind of weird, but they don't. People say things about angels and spirits and things like that, and I know that they know better. It's sort of like I knew a man who, wonderful man, wonderful preacher, one of the most knowledgeable preachers I ever knew, and he would go every day and he would eat at his wife's grave, but she's not there anymore. And I think he knew that in his heart, but there was still a point of closeness there. I think we think things and we kind of hold to things, even in lieu of what we might know in our hearts to be true. I don't think, I just think that they have heard that all their lives, that dinosaurs and men didn't live together. And it's just there. It's knowledge that they have in a compartment in their mind, and their Bible knowledge is over here, and the two nary meet until the preacher gets up and goes, "Hey, dinosaurs and men live together." And then they see now their two things are in conflict. They can't quite. Well, I don't want to disagree with him. I don't agree with evolution, but I got dinosaurs, and they just can't live. And here's the question that inevitably comes. So are you saying dinosaurs were on the ark? I'm like, yes. and Job, I mean, when you look at the behemoth or the Leviathan, even our Bibles, even the translators, they try to make those something, anything but a dinosaur. I love the behemoth being, an elephant or a hippopotamus. And it talks about its tail swings like a cedar. Have you ever seen the tails on those things? I mean, let's do everything we can to make sure those dinosaurs aren't there in the Bible. And and people look at us like we're idiots because the world has said it so often. Sometimes the bigger the lie, the easier it is to believe, I guess. But I just find that interesting. We really digress there.
It's almost like it's amazing what our minds, the kind of the mental gymnastics that we can do of accepting two things as true that conflict with each other, but it's like we keep them separate just so that our world makes sense in our minds. And so I guess that's kind of what's happening, because the only other explanation that I had heard was that the devil created dinosaur fossils to trick us, and that one to me was just very bizarre. I didn't even have a response to that one, but
I've had to
apparently
tell
some
people.
people believe that.
I've had to tell people in the church, guys, dinosaurs are real. Okay, now stop going out there making us look dumb. Okay, because they're
We have to
absolutely.
go take a church field trip to the Museum of Natural History so you can see the.
Well, I took my kids, I took my teen group when I was in Denver. I took them up into the mountains, and you can go up there and see dinosaur prints. I mean, I knew where to go to, you could go see them, and we'd take them and go, and they're real, and don't, please don't go there. I know you're having a hard time reconciling that, but don't go off the deep end and just say, well, they didn't exist, because they did, and there's just no way around that. But when we think about this, we talked about this a moment ago. The two positions, we have Christians out there that are trying to. Cody, of course, you said that while ago. What your brain does, you're the person with the psychology degree, so maybe you understand that better than I do. But you have Christians that are trying to make these two coexist, and some do it almost inadvertently, but some are doing it very deliberately. And what they don't realize is evolutionists don't like them, and neither do Christians, because Christians are not looking to be evolutionists, and evolutionists are not looking to be Christians. So, they're kind of in a group all their own in the middle there somewhere. And but what they don't understand is these things are diametrically opposed to each other. It's either God created man or man evolved from a lower life form. It's either God created the universe or there was this mystical cataclysmic explosion that set it all in motion. Animals either reproduce after their own kind or they reproduce through evolution into a completely different kind of animals. I mean, that's just that's just three things right there that we could say they're diametrically opposed, but yet those are at the heart of this issue, isn't it? Aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I read a book one time when I was in college that it was called "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me." And it talks about the idea of cognitive dissonance, where people, they'll these new facts will come about, and they'll have to try and work them into their worldview. And like one of the examples that was given of this was whenever Bush was saying that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there's still people today that are convinced that they found these weapons of mass destruction that we actually ended up realizing never existed in the first place. And so I think that that's kind of what's going on with that is they have to find some way to kind of quieten that internal conflict that's going on in their minds. And so to do that, it's almost like they can't do it with those two facts, and so they just have to keep them separated like that.
Oh yeah.
And I think it has almost caused kind of what you're saying is like they don't fit in with anybody because they're saying one thing that the evolutionists don't agree with, and they're saying another thing that the religious world doesn't agree with. And I think that that's almost see that same thing within the denominational world today of everybody's trying to adopt every belief system to kind of appease everybody, make an appeal to everybody, make what they believe look good. And they don't realize that they're trying to bring in all of these ideas that just cannot go together.
Yeah. You got one. I mean, and we're just talking about, and I term it like this: the Christ-believing world. Okay, you got some that don't believe Jesus is God. You got some that don't believe in the Godhead. How do you reconcile? How can both of those be right? If Jesus is God and you won't recognize him as God, well, then you're not confessing him as the Son of God, right? I mean, how do you reconcile that? So it's okay not to believe Jesus is God, or it just becomes so convoluted when you try to make everything right. Nothing's going to end up being right, because everything is just watered down into this singular mess of things. It's all, when you look at Daniel chapter 3, let me get that right. Daniel chapter 3. It's almost what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do. He built his image out there and had people go out to worship it. And it said they played all kinds of music. And the way that is worded is that they played every kind of music that there was. Can you imagine the noise that was? I mean, they didn't have rock and roll back then, but you'd had some rock and roll, some country, all going at the same time. But they were trying to do that. The same thing was going on in the church at Corinth, right? Everybody was trying to do their thing all at the same time, and it just made a mess. Everybody can't be right, and the Bible is pretty clear about that. And yet, like you say, universalism says that all that really matters is that you have some kind of acknowledgement of Jesus Christ, and everything else is just your way to get there, as if we're the way, the truth, and the life, right? Instead of Jesus Christ himself. I guess the one way to sum it up is that lies and truth cannot be combined, and you come out with truth. That's not how it works. I had a person say to me one time, well, let's just put everything out on the table and let the truth rise out of it. Well, if you're throwing lies on the table, truth's never going to rise out of it. I'm sorry. That's what I had to tell him. I've had this question asked to me too. Nathan, how can all those scientists be wrong? Well, I don't think all scientists are wrong. I think some are pretty honest. I do. I don't. I think there's people that have a pulpit, or they have a reach. It's kind of they don't have to be the majority to be the loudest sometimes. And it sounds like there's a lot of them. But there's reputable scientists out there that began as evolutionists, but through honest and open research, because I think there's honest people out there, they came to the conclusion that there had to be something else. Okay, I've read their writings. I've kind of read how they came to their conclusions, and they came to realize the inconsistencies and the contradictions in the evolutionary mindset, and they came to believe in. It's not necessarily the God of the Bible. Okay, I want you to understand that, but they believe in something bigger, something greater than this accident of evolution. That there had to be an architect, that like your box illustration, there had to be somebody that designed it and put it together to explain
It at least leads them to an intelligent design of some sort.
And that's the term, intelligent design. That's where a lot of them land. Now some make it all the way to God, but a lot of them land with this idea of what we call intelligent design. That universe didn't just happen by accident, right? It didn't just fall in, blow up, and all this organization came about. And some have even taken it to another level, right? Well, we got to have somebody smarter, so it was aliens. But somewhere down the line, if they stay honest, somewhere down the line they're going to run into that same question, right? That we mentioned earlier. Well, where did the aliens come from? When you just keep backing up, you're always going to come to that same question when you're dealing in origins. But scientists, they can be wrong, can't they?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't even agree on these things.
School, and learning science, like that was something that we were taught about the scientific method. Is you're gonna, an experiment's gonna fail more times than it'll succeed. So it's that process of searching. But what the sad thing is there probably are scientists that are coming to those conclusions that there is intelligent design and everything. And in this world of information, that's something that should be easily accessible. But once they reach that, they start writing about that, then they get censored. They start having that peer review, and other scientists are not letting that information reach the mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't, I really don't know how they, I mean, when we think about that, they have to acknowledge that. I think, okay, it's like these preachers out there in the religious world that predict that the world's coming to an end, right? And it doesn't come to an end. Clearly, it hasn't. And so, what do we get? Well, we get. We don't ever get that retraction, do we? We don't ever get that moment where they retract what they said because they were wrong, because we're still here. Everybody knows you're wrong. You might as well admit it. But it's the same thing in the scientific community. They can't seem to admit it when they're wrong. I mean, clearly they keep coming. There used to be a statistic I read about how many vestigial organs that scientists said we had back in the 60s, and it was a lot in our human body, the leftovers from evolution. And now it's like there's almost like none. I mean, they were wrong then. I remember when I was a teenager, it was global cooling, and we were about to go into the next ice age, and then we got the global warming, and now we're, global warming is not working out, so we're going to go to climate change. Climate change is the greatest one of all, because you can just blame every little tornado, every little hurricane, everything on climate change. And so, but apparently they were wrong. We didn't go in an ice age. We didn't burn up. Al Gore said by 2020 we would have vast numbers of countries that were uninhabitable, and yet here we are. And that just simply has not come true. But I haven't seen him come back and recant those things yet. They just kind of change it, like you say. They just kind of jump off, and that dissonance thing you were talking about. Once again, things I don't understand fully. But you look at the age of the universe; it goes up and down like a roller coaster. It can gain 100 million years just like that.
What's funny to me about that one is it keeps getting longer. It's I think they realize that the awesome accomplishment of God, everything that He's created, it's like they can't even fathom how long it actually took. And at some point they're gonna reach the point where it's like the Earth is older than they have the age of the universe, because they realize that it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it is. Oh, yeah. I mean, but they have to do that, and I think that's when I think that's why you see these, they fight so hard to keep intelligence design out of our schools, right? And I think that's the reason why. They don't want to have a reasoned debate where you have both placed up there for you to look at and to consider and to do so reasonably, because it's going to hurt them if they do. Because when you put it up there logically, there are holes. And unless you're indoctrinated, unless that's really, you're going to be there no matter what, kind of like the Pharisees with Jesus, you're going to hold this position no matter what, then, an open mind's going to turn from it, because it's just so clearly got all these gaps in what is true and right. Well, so let's think about for just a moment. I just want to touch on theistic evolution. And just a couple of the theories that are out there that if you're a Christian, you're probably going to hear these things. Evolution is probably, I doubt they listen to these things. I doubt they care. They're not really looking to merge the Bible into their beliefs. They think it's a bunch of made up stuff. So this is really about people that are trying to make evolution fit into Christianity, and we need to understand that's the motive. But those that hold to evolution state that time is their greatest ally. So, when we look at the one theory called the day age theory, they start trying to cram time, all this time that evolution believes it needs, into the days, those 6 days of creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. They think that if you have enough time, anything is possible. So if you're going to believe in evolution and try to fit it in the Bible, then you're going to need to have the earth older than 6,000 years, 6,000, a little bit, maybe give or take there, years that the Bible tells us, and even scientific evidence would support that as well. But that will not work if you want to believe in evolution. Here's what a professor at one of our Christian universities once said. He said, "It's not recommended that one should allow a general impression gained from the reading of Scripture to crystallize in his mind as absolute truth." Did you just catch that? Don't really think the Bible is true, okay? In every case. A reading of the first few chapters of Genesis leaves one with the very definite impression that life has existed on earth for, at most, a few thousand years. That conclusion is in conflict with the conclusions of modern science and that the earth is ancient. Okay? So see, the professor's problem is that he believes in evolution as absolutely right, and the Bible's not. See, it's a misplaced faith. It's a misplaced where he is truly determined to make inroads in evolution, not with the Bible. And
What's ironic about that is the ones that put out stuff like that are the ones that will call us closed-minded.
Yeah. They will, but yet they're closed-minded as to on their side of the argument. Yeah. I want to talk about that. So they make these 6 days long geological times, millions and millions of years. Each of these days, God finishes with evening and the morning was the first day, second day, whatever. But they make it not an evening and a morning, but millions and millions, hundreds of millions of evenings and mornings. Of years, they're in those times. Some say the events of that chapter could not have happened. And when they talk about day 5, especially, day 6. When you come to day 6, they don't want to believe that all that happens on day 6 could happen in that one day. So since that day is recorded like the other 5 days, it means that the other 5 days were not indicative of 24-hour days either. Now, that's what they say, okay? Because these things couldn't have happened. Well, let's take, for example, on day 6. So God creates Adam and Eve. He creates animals, right? And then God has Adam do what?
Every one of them.
What does God have Adam do with the animals?
Name them.
Name them. Okay. So this professor says must have taken a good deal of study for Adam to examine each specimen and decide on an appropriate name for it, especially in view of the fact that he had absolutely no human tradition behind him so far as nomenclature was concerned. It must have required some years, or at the very least, a considerable number of months for him to complete a comprehensive inventory of all the bird, beast, and insects that populated the Garden of Eden. So this is a great example here of the theory becoming the father of exegesis, right? I've already determined what I want it to mean. And so how I'm going to see Scripture and understand Scripture is going to come from what I've already determined I want it to mean. And you know, it's filled with assumptions. It's filled with erroneous views, just like most evolutionary thoughts are. It kind of leaves out the fact that God brought him the animals. They came to him. He didn't have to go find them. He didn't have to research them. God created animals according to kind. Okay, so we got dogs and cats. Not every kind of dog and cat, right? We don't, you know. He didn't say, okay, you're a Labradoodle, you're a Dachshund, you're a pit bull. You know, he wasn't doing all the types of dogs, right? Do what?
You know, if you really think about it, I mean, I feel like this could even be a case of today as well, like something that could be done today, even with a more complex mindset. But like, it doesn't take that long to name anything,
No.
just to simply name it. I could look at an animal and think of the first thing that comes to my mind and be like, okay, I'll call it that, and then look at another one and call it that. And so it really wouldn't take that long. And going back on what he was saying about Adam not having, what was it, human tradition
Yeah.
or more complex thought, then okay, then wouldn't that mean that this would be quick and done? I mean, just doesn't have to put much thought into it.
Well, I think it shows Adam was intelligent, and
Right.
and you know,
Right. Yeah.
people try to play on that, but I look at in the book of Acts, the apostles just simply had no idea of the kingdom 10 days before the day of Pentecost, because even just before Jesus ascended. But the minute the Holy Spirit came upon them, they understood things a whole lot better, right? You
But
go
why not
back.
the same for Adam?
Yeah, Adam had knowledge given to him from a divine perspective. God
Right.
gave him the knowledge that he had. So he didn't need tradition. He didn't have to learn things that you and I have to learn. He was walking the day that he was created. You and I had to learn to walk. Adam was given divine knowledge. You know, he was given knowledge from God. And so he had all that he needed to accomplish whatever task God wanted him to accomplish. Think about Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel. That's one that always gets me, right? So not only, if you're going to change people's language, what do you think about what God did? Okay, so we always talk about, well, yeah, he changed their language so they couldn't communicate anymore. But hold on. God had to not only change what they were speaking, he had to change the way they thought. He had to change their memories, because if they could remember in the old language, they could speak the old language, right? But they can't even speak the old language anymore, so all their memories now are in the new language. I mean, God can, we're his creation. He can do whatever he wants with us. Really,
Not to mention, there's probably
demonstrates
several
that.
lingo differences between languages. I mean, you think about like ways we can say things in one language that it just would not work in another
Yeah.
language. So like even to change that kind of thought process is just adds to that complexity.
Yeah, I mean, that miracle with the Tower of Babel is just incredible to think about what went into that to make that what it ended up being. You know, God wanted them to spread out, and they did. And obviously, certain, you know, groups of people spoke the same language and they spread out together. But there was, you know, definitely a deeper thing than just, oh, all of a sudden I speak Spanish. I mean, it's not like speaking tongues in the New Testament. It is a completely different language, and that's the only language you can speak. And so that, otherwise it doesn't work the way that the Bible says that it did. So,
And you know, I guess one more thing to add to that. You know, I just thought of this, but what about things they wrote down? I don't know exactly how they dealt with written stuff, but how did that get dealt
language is
with? Did that
multi-layered,
get
isn't it? I
changed?
mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of aspects to language.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. I didn't think about that. See, now you just made me have to think more about it. You know, there were, you know, when we talk about these creatures that he's naming, so Adam has the ability to name these animals. That also eliminates another thing that people can't hardly handle, and that eliminates the caveman, right? We didn't come from the dumb old Nathan. Adam wasn't a Neanderthal or a Cro-Magnon man or whatever you want. He wasn't out there clubbing Eve over the head with a club. He was an intelligent person, even at that particular time, and so he names those animals that God brought to him, but it really wasn't even about naming the animals, and we can talk about this a little bit later. The purpose for naming the animals was a completely different purpose than just for the animals to have names. They'd have got names like Jonah was talking about. They'd have got names eventually. Somebody had seen one and said, well, that looks like this or whatever. And they'd have got a name. But there was a reason behind that. You also look at these guys and they try to take Hebrew words in the Old Testament. They try to be theologians too. So now they're scientists, but they also want to try to be a Hebrew theologian. And they try to turn words that are in the Bible into words that would fit into this thing. And they take the Hebrew word day, that's translated day. It's the Hebrew word yom, and the word day, which is yamin. And those are found 2,300 times in the Old Testament. And we see yamin in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, where, it says that in 6 days God created these things, created all things in heaven and on earth. Everything that was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And that's tied to the Ten Commandments, right? Likewise, he says, you work 6 days, and then on the seventh day you rest. It's the Sabbath law. And so, he's not telling them, y'all work 6 long, indefinite periods of time and then take a rest, right, for a long, indefinite period. It's 6 24-hour days, and then you rest on the seventh day. 700 times in the Old Testament, we see it, and it always means, we see that yom, it always means a 24-hour period, a 24-hour day, when it's not being used prophetically. Now, that's key. There are times when it's being used in a prophetic sense, so it's symbolic. So Daniel in the, he uses a day, and every day is a year in his prophecy as he is prophesying about when Christ is to come. But we understand that. We know that that's a prophecy. But we don't, we scriptures are literal until we have a reason from Scripture to know that they are symbolic or metaphorical in some way. And so, they try to use that, but that's not going to work. When those words yom or yamin are modified with words like evening or words like morning, and that's 300 times in the Old Testament, it always is a 24-hour day. And so, this is just something that's been made up by man. Verses 14 through 15 of Genesis 1 says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be signs for seasons and days and for years. Okay, if a day is not a day, then what is a week? What is a year in this text? What is being marked? Times are being marked as we know them to this day, right? This verse makes absolutely no sense if the days there in chapter 1 of Genesis are not a 24-hour period of time. The moon comes up, the sun comes up. Those are the parts of the day. The stars, those are the things that come up and mark the different aspects of a 24-hour period, ultimately, of the day. Now, a day is not by what's going on in the sky, is it? A day is a what? It's a rotation, one single rotation of the planet. And so, I've heard people say, well, what about people in Alaska where it's dark all day long for 6 months, right? Or it's dark for 6 months. Well, they still spin, okay? They still make their revolution. It's just the tilt of the earth makes that take place for them. But there's nothing in the original languages that would indicate that these days were anything but 24-hour days. And if anybody's telling you otherwise, they're not being honest with you, or they don't know what they're talking about, one of the two. Anything you guys want to say on that?
The Garden of Eden could not possibly have been in Alaska, so the point is mute.
Yeah, unless the Euphrates River was a whole lot longer back then than it is now. Would have had to go a long way to get up there. The other theory is the gap theory, and this theory actually came about in the 19th century with a man named Thomas Chandler. There's some that say it went back further than that, but that's unclear. What they want to do is they place a gap between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then you have a gap, and then the earth was without form and void, right? As it says in 2. Within that gap, they place billions of years. And they say it was during this time that the dinosaurs and pre-Adam man, I guess that'd be the Cro-Magnon guys, pre-Adam man lived. I mean, these are words they're just making up, folks. They actually say that God had all this time so that he put all this time in there so we'd have oil today. So you can be thankful to the gap in between verses 1 and 2 for the gas in your car, because that's when all that happened, to get that oil down in the earth that came from all that biomatter that was buried up during this gap time. Well, they actually say that God had all this time there, and that there are those who hold this position. They claim that a cataclysm then destroyed the earth, and their idea on this is that a lot of people hold this idea that it was the satanic rebellion, Satan's sin, that this war with God, as if you could even war with God. I find that to be such an absurd idea. This satanic rebellion led to the destruction of the earth that had been created, and God remade it in Genesis chapter 1. Oftentimes, men who claim this want to be considered as Bible experts, but they're not. One of the very well-known teachers of this, and he actually is brought into some of our Christian universities and allowed to speak, and I wish they wouldn't, because it only causes confusion. But he said God came into being before time began. Now, what's fundamentally wrong with that statement? I mean, this is not a hard one. This is a fundamental statement when you say God came into being. What's wrong with that?
I've got one word for that: eternal.
Exactly. God never came into being. He is. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. He is the eternal present. There is no past with God. There is no point where he came into being. Psalm 90 verse 2 says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God, right? And so that denotes, and so here's this guy that wants to claim that he knows so much about the Bible, and yet he's got God coming into being at some point. And that's so fundamentally wrong, that and so degrades God, that it's hard to fathom that.
Does he have any scripture that, if he's using it, he's twisting it, but does he have any scriptural evidence of his belief of that? Or is that, again, like we've talked about before, is that a conclusion that he's coming to because he's already concluded something else is true?
Yeah, it comes out of, they try to take these words that are found there in Genesis chapter 1, the word bara and the word asa, and there is an assumption that bara must refer to an only original creation. They're making an assumption about the language here, not this isn't the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And asa refers to the making of something or remaking of something. And so since both words are used in the Genesis account of creation, they state that God was remaking things that had been destroyed when using the word asa. And so such an argument has been refuted by Hebrew language scholars over and over again. I mean, these things have been soundly defeated, but they still hang around. The two words can be used interchangeably. Let me give you an example. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. It says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, that's bara, in the day that the Lord made, that's asa, earth and heaven. And so you see both words used in that singular verse right there. And so, they also will butcher the word hyetha in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2, going back to the earth was formless and void. The word is translated there properly, it's was. In other words, the earth was formless and void. They want to change it and make it mean became. Now that changes it all, doesn't it? The earth became formless and void. Well, that fits in with your gap. You had the earth, and then it became, through the satanic rebellion, it became formless and void. Then God had to remake it. But it's simply, Hebrew scholars agree that the word means was, and it's not became. It's sort of like taking the word ace in the New Testament, which means to become, or to bring about to bring about, not because of. That we're baptized for the remission of our sins, the remission of our sins, to bring about remission of sins, not because we've already had them forgiven. And people try that too, and Greek scholars will tell you the same thing. I heard one Greek scholar say, that's not bad Greek, that's just not Greek at all. You're just making up words now. And so, yeah, Cody, that's where they kind of draw from that text, or that's the assumptions they make, or the changes they make to try to justify this. That same guy also wrote that Jesus was sexually seduced on numerous occasions. Now, later he would say he didn't say that, but until he was confronted with the quote itself. In a book review, he wrote that the incident in Mark chapter 2 and verses 23 through 24, he said, where Jesus violates the seventh day command is related to this question. Well, Jesus didn't violate the Sabbath command in that particular text. He made it very clear that the disciples were innocent on that occasion. That, yeah, they violated the traditions of the Pharisees, but they didn't violate Moses' command, of keeping the Sabbath day holy. He also claims that God only created man to prove his way was better than Satan's. I mean, you can just see how small that kind of thinking is. So you're bringing God down to this petty, I'm going to prove my way's better. Well, Satan's created by God. He doesn't have anything to prove to him, no more than he has anything to prove to us. And so God doesn't, you bring him down to our level as if he needs to prove something. He doesn't have to prove anything. And so you can tell, it immediately is seen clearly as, something from a man, because you brought God down to the man level, things we would do. I'm going to prove, it's like, when I want to prove to Cody that Macs are better than PCs. It's so petty when he's so sure of himself about those things, and so that's what they're doing with God in these situations, and it's so sad to see, and they don't even realize they're doing it. They're just so intent on making it's still what you were talking about earlier, making what they believe makes sense. That they say stupid stuff like that, and they don't even realize that you just said something that's incredibly dumb from a biblical perspective. So I think that you see that in this particular case. The gap theory just simply won't hold up either under any kind of real biblical language scrutiny. And it's just a case of what Peter talked about in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 16, where people will twist the scriptures to their own destruction. And I think that's the case with these things. You guys have anything else on that?
Don't believe so.
All right. Well, let's kind of jump forward and talk a little bit about the first day of mankind, and the lesson that the second lesson, or the second podcast of this week. You think about the garden. God, you get down here to man, right? And God really begins to do some special things, doesn't he? He begins to, he spoke things into existence. He just says it and it happens throughout chapter 1 there, as you go through the 6 days of creation. As of the morning of the sixth day, he creates the land animals. And then things change, and Cody, you made mention of this before we started recording. When you look back there at Genesis, at the end of Genesis chapter 1 in verse 26, that all of a sudden then it says, then God said, let us. All these other times it's God said, God made, God said, God created, God said, God made, God placed. I'm just looking at God saw.
Mhm.
Okay, so I was just kind of just looking at the text there and kind of just going down it, and that's what you get. And then you get here to 26, and it's let us make man in our own image. You know, the whole tone changes with that moment. Don't you kind of feel that?
Yeah, absolutely. And to anyone that is watching or listening, if you've got the text open in front of you, I think that you can just see this stark contrast. If you just look at your text and you read verse 24 there, where it says, "Then God said, let the earth bring forth." And then two verses later, where you have that change, it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image." And you just really see that his hand is in it more. It's more than just it being spoken into existence. He's working through us.
Yes. And and then you drop down, and you see that God made man from the dust, right? He gets down there and he forms that body out of the dust of the field, and he creates that body of man, and then he breathes into it, and it becomes a living soul. Just all of that. There is mentioned in the shorter podcast this week. All of that has such an intimacy to it. That we see that man is special in that particular. So many people are looking for the reason why they are special, and yet they keep missing the primary reason, and that is that God made them, and that they are his ultimate in creation. That's in verse 7 of chapter 2, when it says that he formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils and the breath of life, and the man became a living soul, or a living being, depending on your translation. But God truly wanted to do something special here, and it was more than any other part of his creation, and we see him do that, and then immediately after that, there in chapter 2, God not only creates the man and makes him a living being, but then he immediately makes a place for him to dwell. Right, he makes him this great garden, the Garden of Eden, and so he provides for him immediately, and then God is okay. I want us to make sure we understand this. God didn't create man and go, "Oops, he looks lonely." I think some people almost think that. Well, I should have thought that one through before I did that.
Something's missing here. I can't put my finger on it.
I mean, everything that's happening from this point forward is for us. Okay, it's for Adam and Eve, and it's ultimately for us, that we understand who God made us for. And the reason why there's male and female. That's what God wants us to understand. We can kind of get lost in our weird thoughts on some of this stuff sometimes, but that's ultimately what's called for. He looks and he says it's not good for man to be alone, right? Now, most people would say, that knows me very well, they say it's not good for Nathan not to be with Jeannie, because she keeps him in control. And there may be some truth to that, but God's really talking about something more than that. Adam's not going to be able to do the things that need to be done to be fruitful and multiply without a woman. That's, when we see God saying all through chapter 1, and he looked at it and it was good, right? And he gets done with it all, and he says it's very good. He kind of concludes. What he's saying is it's exactly what is needed. Every day when God created, he's preparing the world for man. He's preparing a world that man can live in. And it was good. In other words, it met what God wanted out of it. It became exactly what he wanted. That made it good. It's not just that it was nice. Hey, it's a nice place to live. No, it was good because God is good. And if God wanted it a particular way and it was that way, then it was good. And so you come down to Adam, and it's not good for man to be alone. Well, because God has a will for man, right, to be fruitful and multiply. And so it can't be good unless he has a what? A woman,
Yeah, as a woman.
a
Yeah.
female. Just like all the animals, male and female, and they're reproducing after their own kind. Well, man can't do that without a woman. And so, there is something missing. But he wants Adam to understand something in that. We talked about the naming the animals. And so God brings all the animals to him and he names them. And then if you take note that after he names the animals, what is realized is that there is nothing in the animal kingdom that fits Adam.
I want to take us back to that breath of life real quick.
Oh, yeah, go
before we
ahead.
move on from this, because if you see all these living beings are being paraded in front of Adam, and we're never told that those living beings are given that breath of life, and yet they're living beings. And so, and I'm gonna not pronounce it right, but what is the word for spirit? It's like
Pneuma. Well, the
pneuma or
Greek is
something like that.
pneuma. I'm not sure what the Hebrew is, but the Greek is pneuma.
Pneuma. But yeah, that's what I'm talking about though. But it means wind, right?
It means
And so that's
spirit,
almost,
wind, breath. Yeah.
yeah, it's almost like the feeling that you get from that breath that was breathed into Adam is there's that difference there, because this is not just life like what was given to the other living beings. It was that spirit that was given to him. And so in this moment where all these other living beings are being marched in front of him, it's almost like Adam can recognize that they aren't given that same breath that he was given.
Yes. Well, it says, that he became, some translations say a living soul. And we carry an eternal soul within us, given to us by God. And that's really makes us unique from the animals. There's a difference in being living and having a soul that lives within a body. I know people want to believe their dogs go to heaven, and if that's what God wants to do, he'll do it. But there's no indication that there's anything with the dog that's going to go on past the time that he dies. But for man, that's different, and that's because of this particular text that you're talking about, that he became a living. So you can go to John chapter 1. When you look over at John chapter 1, and John's talking about the Word, and of course, when he's talking about the Word there, he's talking about Jesus Christ. Verse 14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld him as of the only begotten of the Father." But up in verse 4, as he's talking about him, after he says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, he says, "In him was life." And that's a part of this description of the Word, that Jesus was life. And what that doesn't mean that Jesus was living. I mean, we know he was. Jesus was alive on this earth. He's alive as God, but it has nothing to do with that. It means literally he is the source of life. So when we read this, when we read that God breathed into him, and you're talking about, let us, you're talking about the Godhead there, right? You got all three parts of the Godhead, the Spirit and Jesus and the Father, all involved in this situation. When you see this, when you think about who breathed into Adam and he became a living soul, it was Jesus Christ. Just as for us as Christians, Jesus breathes spiritually into us and we become a living soul as far as right before God. In the same way, all life, spiritual life, physical life, comes from Jesus Christ. That's why he says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except by me." Right? I'm the life. I'm where it all comes from, and it began here in the garden, and it would be a spiritual version of it as he died upon the cross to provide that same life to us later. It's a powerful point to make as you see Jesus on both sides. Jesus is the active agent in creation. It doesn't say it in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, but John chapter 1 says it, Colossians chapter 1 says it, Hebrews chapter 1 says it. Tells us that Jesus was the active agent of creation. In fact, all things were created for him, and through him they were all made. And so, we need to understand that he is very active at this particular point. I think we almost think he's not here, but yet John says in the beginning was the Word. In other words, he was there. He predated Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. And so that puts him in eternity. makes him that eternal I am that we see in John chapter 8 and verse 56. So, we have Adam and we have him created. We have, that the very hands-on aspect of it. And now he says it's not good for man to be alone. So he wants Adam to understand that there's nothing else in this creation like you. And once Adam kind of comes to that realization, then God puts him in a deep sleep, right? Takes his rib. And again, it's very hands-on. He could have just said, let's have a woman. And she'd have appeared right there in front of him. But he takes the rib from Adam. That's very hands-on, even with Adam. And then he shapes her out of that. So she's still shaped from the dust. And we talk about from the dust we came, from the dust we return. Well, he came from the dust, and she came from him, and so she came from dust as well. And God shapes her, and he gives her to him. And so then we get into those texts. And Joni, you were talking about these and how that they are reiterated later. That as Adam considers her, that she was taken from him. It's interesting. I kind of think about, I don't know about you guys. I may have some weird thoughts. I don't know. I sit around and I think about things and what it was like to maybe be there. How he understands that she came from him. Did God just straight up tell him, hey, I took a rib? Again, we see this. Adam has a good deal of intelligence, doesn't he? I mean, he understands what's going on here. He says, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she will be called woman because she was taken out of man. I mean, there's some heavy reasoning going on there. And I mean, he's not.
That's a very intelligent statement.
It is. I mean,
from someone who's a day old.
He's not going, with his club. I mean, he
Well, not to make light
understands
of,
this.
of what's happening here, but I had someone tell me one time that they wondered if the next time Adam went to bed and fell asleep, if he got up the next morning and counted his ribs to make sure there wasn't another person on.
He slept with his arms real tight.
Yeah.
Right?
Don't want to lose another one of those.
So, he makes that statement, and then the Bible gives us the statement, right? For this reason. What reason? Well, because woman is flesh of his flesh, of man's flesh. She's bone of his bones, right? That she is taken from man. In other words, she is made for him, from him. It says, for this reason. Always, when you see that kind of phrase, you got to back up and find out what the reason is. A man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And Joni, you mentioned that Jesus is gonna reiterate that reality as well.
Yeah, we see this reiterated again in Matthew chapter 19, verse 5, saying pretty much word for word, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And I find that very interesting because when we see this statement put here at the end of Genesis chapter 2, it almost kind of feels like an additional statement on top of a story. Because the first two chapters of Genesis, it's told like a story. God did this and this, and this how this was created, and we get to this point, and then we get this statement. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, et cetera, et cetera. It's establishing in this verse. It is establishing God's intent for man and woman from the very beginning. It's showing its purpose and its origin, which also goes along with the love and the care that God put into creation. Going back to the time He took to take out Adam's ribs, to make Adam out of the dust, and all this care for man and woman and how He created them. I mean, He could have just said it and just it all immediately happened, but there was a purpose to all of this. And here at the very end of the chapter, we see, for this reason, or in the English Standard Version, it says therefore. That word therefore, because of all these things.
You got to look at what therefore is therefore.
This is what we establish.
You got to look at what therefore is therefore, right?
Yeah, therefore, and Jesus will say later, and talking about divorce, he was like, but from the beginning it was not so, and we literally see that here in this verse. In the beginning it was not so for divorce. When we see a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
Yes.
Well, something I found fascinating about this passage there that you're talking about in Matthew 19, and And this is something that it seems like even within the church we skip over. We read this passage to figure out why can't I get divorced? But you got to think about how Jesus answered that question, because they ask him, can I divorce my wife for any reason at all? And that was the perfect time for Jesus to jump in and go, only if they've committed adultery. But that's not what he does. He goes back to the beginning and talks about that original concept, and ends that with saying, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And so, Jesus's answer to their question is no. You can't divorce them basically for that reason.
He does.
But
I mean, that is his point. I mean, he's saying, let me, they ask him a question. They want him to answer the question from Deuteronomy, or, answer a question in regard to Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 about what it means, there where it says that if a woman has lost favor in the eyes of a man, that he can give her a writing a divorce. But he doesn't answer that. They say, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? But he doesn't answer. He goes, well, don't you know what it says? Going all the way back to the beginning, right? He quotes that from there when Adam and Eve the very first marriage. For this reason, man shall leave father and mother, shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. But he also says, I mean, Jesus gives us commentary on this action as well, because it says right before that, and that this applies to modern day issues. He made them male and female. Okay. So marriage exists in one place, and it's made in one place because God made man and woman for that institution. It's not made because we're in love. It's made because we're male and female. And so, and it's not, you can't propagate, you can't do any of the things in regard to that, the things that God had told them to do, at least back then, without that joining. And so he made that institution for that moment. So there's a commentary here on the actual what marriage is, because we have that question flying around our society today.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to me too is the kind of the contrast of what God says from the beginning, because he says from the beginning, it's not good for man to be alone. But then Jesus goes and he has this teaching, and the reaction of Jesus's own disciples is that it's better for man not to marry if this is how it is. So it's like even Jesus's own followers, the ones closest to him, are saying, they're holding on to those earthly thoughts, those earthly desires, and going in contradiction from what God has said from the beginning.
Well, they're demonstrating what Jesus said. He said, for 2,000 years, there was no divorce. From the beginning, it was not this way. But he says in verse 8 of Matthew 19, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted it. Very interesting concept. I recently in class here at church where I'm at, had some questions in regard to polygamy. And, there's no getting around the fact that God allowed it, that God for a time allowed it in the Old Testament, and we see that. We can't argue that. I mean, the fact that now the whys, I don't have all the answers to the why God chose to do what he did. But every place that we see marriage spoken of, it's spoken of monogamously. Now, there was a way that God wanted it, and there was a way, things that God allowed because of the hardness of men, right? And divorce is the same thing. There is the way, see, when Jesus is asked the question, what does he say? He sees marriage without divorce, period. That's how he sees it. That's his first statement, that it doesn't exist like that. But God allows it. And it's the same thing with polygamy. It's not what God wanted. He always spoke monogamously about marriage, but yet he permitted polygamy, but it was never what he wanted. So when he spoke about it, he would talk about in Ecclesiastes, written by a guy that certainly had a polygamy problem, but it was always the wife of your youth, the wife, husband with a good wife. It doesn't say husband with good wives. I mean, if God approved of polygamy in general, then he would have made that a plural, but it was always made in a singular, husband and wife, not husband and wives. And so, there are things that God, and this is kind of a difficult concept for us sometimes to understand. There are things that God wants a particular way, but he makes accommodation to men for whatever reason. And divorce is one of those. Jesus makes that very clear, because of the hardness of your hearts, he permitted it. It's not what he wants, but he allowed it. And it's the same in Christianity today. It's still permitted. and it's permitted still for the same reason, because men have hard hearts. And so, you see that, but Jesus is giving a commentary to this text here in Genesis chapter 2 of what's taking place there and what God intended in that moment. And we're seeing it from the perspective of God himself as Jesus is speaking. And so that's, that I think that's how we should view it. I agree with you, Cody. I think sometimes we take text like Matthew 19 and we live on one subject in them at the exclusion of other things that are being taught at the same time, right? There's a teaching there to be taught in regard to divorce and remarriage, but the real teaching is about marriage. And what God way it was from the very beginning. So and also we have to also remember that it is this today when we talk about women's roles in the church and people talk about the church as the last great men's club or whatever, and there's all this, well, women can do just as good. Women's roles have never been about women being inadequate. It has never been about women being not as good as a man at public speaking or teaching or whatever it is. That has nothing to do with it. I can tell you what, there's a vast number of women that can sing far better than I can, or or even teach better than I can, maybe. But that has nothing to do with it. It's not about ability. It's about order. And Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that it is the order of creation and the order in which sin took place that has brought about this reality of God, of the role of women and men in the church. He says that that Adam was created first and Eve sinned first, and those are the two things that have determined this order that women are to have. That is placed upon women. So this goes all the way back here to this moment where she's created from Adam. They're created for each other. They are helpers suitable for each other. They, the idea is like a puzzle piece that they fit together, that they're made for each other. And I tell you, a woman and a man are the only, they're made for each other, and nobody else is made for them. Nobody else can accomplish the things that God wants to accomplish like a man and a woman can do. You can't do it. And so there's only one way that can be done, and regardless of what people say today. Anything else on that first day of mankind?
I believe so.
All right. Well, had a good beginning here in episode 1. Cody, we still went an hour and a half. It's always important for Cody to get to that hour and a half mark, and so we tried to do that. Well, next week we will see that this first family, we got the marriage tonight. We got Adam and Eve, and we got the husband and the wife, but that's going to expand. But we're going to see this first family is going to have struggles, just as our families do. But I think one of the things that we're going to see and understand in that is that those troubles, just like today, tend to be a product of sin. So we encourage you to keep studying God's Word, and we will see you next week.